Okay, well, once again, good evening, everyone. And I was sharing with Sharon that as I was preparing for Hannukah this year, I felt more moved by the story than ever before. And that is because I feel that it has a real message for us at this particular time. So Hannukah, I've got a little subtitle down here, which is the Hebrew, Nes Gadol Haya Sham. And that's the way the Hebrews describe what took place at Hannukah. It means a great miracle was there. So what was this great miracle? Well, of course, we find it in the story of the Maccabees, which we tell at this festival. Now, I have a quote here from one of my favorite books, and that is Ivanhoe by Walter Scott. And it's set in the time of the Crusades, Richard the Lionheart. And it has as one of its characters a Jewish woman, a beautiful Jewish maiden called Rebecca. And she's, long story, but she's locked in a castle with the knight Ivanhoe, and they're having a conversation. And he is telling her how important chivalry is to him as a knight. And this is her reply. I am indeed, said Rebecca, sprung from a race whose courage was distinguished in the defense of their own land, but who warred not, even while yet a nation, save at the command of the deity, or in defending their country from oppression. The sound of the trumpet wakes Judah no longer, and her despised children are now but the unresisting victims of hostile and military oppression. Well hast thou spoken, Senite, until the God of Jacob shall raise up for his chosen people a second Gideon or a new Maccabeus. It ill beseems the Jewish damsel to speak of battle or of war. So I put that in because it just serves to indicate how the Maccabees have become these renowned, legendary fighters. But their story does not appear in the Bible, well, not in our Protestant Bibles, not in the Old Testament, nor in the New. So why is it that we celebrate it? Because there have, after all, been many, many battles in the scriptures. So why is this one so special? And that's what we're going to be considering tonight. Okay, now the first thing that we notice as we start to unfold the story of the Maccabees is that it took place in what have been called the 400 silent years. That's the span between the time of the prophet Malachi, last book of the Old Testament, and the time of the Gospels. But actually, this period is certainly not silent. And what I want you to do is to imagine you're sitting in your living room watching a movie that's filled with suspense and you're on the edge of your seat, wondering how it's going to turn out, but suddenly the phone rings and you're called away. When you return and you're eager to see what's happened, you find, to your surprise, the characters and the setting seem to have changed. In fact, you can hardly recognize it as the same movie. So that is a little bit like trying to follow the Jewish history as it unfolds in Old and New Testaments with a large gap in the middle. So when the Old Testament closes, I've given you some ideas here. We have a small remnant of the Jewish people. They've been restored to the land. They've rebuilt a temple in Jerusalem, but they inhabit just a tiny fraction of the territory they formerly possessed. They're under foreign domination. They're insignificant subjects of the mighty Persian Empire, and they're speaking Aramaic. Okay, when the New Testament opens, we might be in a different world. First of all, the Persians have completely vanished from the picture, and the Romans now rule over the chosen people. The common language is no longer Hebrew, not Latin, or Aramaic is there, but they are also speaking Greek. What we see is The geographical focus has changed. We hear names like Nazareth and Galilee, which we rarely heard in the Old Testament. We have new social groups that have never been mentioned. They're called Pharisees and Sadducees. And everywhere we have those ubiquitous tax collectors. Where did they come from? And we have a lot of new religious ideas: angels, demons, heaven and hell, resurrection, final judgment, things that are not so much discussed in the Old Testament. So, how did this all take place? To understand the way in which the Old Testament and New Testament relate to one another, we need to know something of what the Jews experienced in this intertestamental period, which is also called the Second Temple period. And we'll see that the times were not silent. They're filled with 400 years of Jewish struggle and suffering, theological speculation, and of course the high point of the period was the victory of the Maccabees over the foreign forces, which sought to dominate the Jewish people, bring about their assimilation to a different culture, and to destroy Torah learning and life. So what I want to do is go back to the start of that period and trace those dramatic events as they unfolded. First, some geography. So the familiar name, let's have a look at the map up here. The familiar name that's given to a map of the Middle East is the Fertile Crescent, and it links these two very large rivers at each end, the side of very fertile valleys. So we've got the Nile and we've got the Tigris and Euphrates. That used to be called Mesopotamia, the middle of the rivers. Now, these two valleys were the center of power in the ancient world, the Eastern and Western world powers between, and the whole Old Testament has as its backdrop the struggle between these world powers, between Egypt and the powers that arose in Mesopotamia, notably Babylon and Assyria. And what we have in between is the promised land. So to the south, we have desert of Arabia. Over here, we have the Sahara Desert. And we've discovered that the only way for travel and trade to take place is down this narrow portion of land, this narrow land bridge, which of course is where Judea and Galilee are. And this was really the crossroads of the ancient world. So the people of Israel were surrounded by these great empires, and the internal politics of the land were dominated by the relationship to those outside powers. And as we know from the Old Testament, the people were hugely attracted by the cultures and spiritualities of the surrounding nations, despite the fact they were warned countless times by the prophets that adopting their ways would lead to disaster. And eventually that great tragedy occurred in 586 BC. The Babylonians came, destroyed Jerusalem, and took her leading citizens captive. Now, toward the end of the Old Testament, we read about a new power that will play a very significant role in those intertestamental events, the Persian Empire. And about a generation after the fall of Jerusalem, God raised up this unlikely deliverer for his chosen people, Cyrus the Great, Emperor of Persia, a man of exceptional talents, who through his conquests of the eastern regions forged the largest empire the world had ever seen and conquered Babylon as well. Now, the Persian Empire spread from India to the border of Egypt. And in 538 BC, he issued a decree that any Jewish exiles who wished to return to Jerusalem could go and set to work rebuilding their temple. So the Jewish people were scattered far and wide, but there were a number who returned. Now, this remnant who returned found that Jerusalem possessed only a shadow of her former glory. And although the new temple was built, it could not compare to that of Solomon. The country remained a vassal of the Persians, and the monarchy was not restored. The official language was Aramaic. And during this Persian period, new religious concepts came into Judaism. And there's a religion in Zoroastrianism was a Persian religion, very similar to Judaism in many ways. And they had a huge focus on angels, demons, an archfiend, resurrection, and final judgment. So we see that these ideas are not discussed greatly in the Old Testament, but they are there. And so we find much more focus on that taking place. For example, we have the first angels with names appearing in the book of Daniel. First time we have Michael and Gabriel, who are actually given names. And we have this whole world where angels are warring on behalf of different nations. And so it opens up this very large cosmic realm. Now, as we continue through the period, we find that we're looking over to the West, and we find that Alexander took the reins of the kingdom of Greece when he was only 20. Now, he was endowed with this passionate love of Greek culture and a missionary zeal, and he dreamed of spreading Hellenistic ideals through the world. So he led his army of 40,000 soldiers across the Dardanelles into Asia Minor with his heart set on the conquest of the entire Persian Empire. And he pressed his armies all the way to Afghanistan, but all the way to India, actually. He died suddenly in 323 BC at the age of 32, but the forces he set in motion were irresistible. Greek customs and philosophies would arise and flourish in the East, combining systematic Greek thoughts with Eastern understandings of divinity. And we see that in the New Testament itself. So with the coming of the Greeks, the situation took a dramatic turn for the Jewish people. Their new overlords were a people from across the sea with whom most Jews had little prior contact. The language was strange and their customs were abhorrent. So a new thing was happening, unlike anything they could have imagined. The whole center of the world had shifted from east to west, and Judaism would never be the same again. Now, Alexander's death brought chaos to his empire, and his 4 leading generals decided they would rule this vast empire, and they decided to partition it between themselves. So we have Cassander, who became the king of Greece. We have Lysimachus of Thrace or Armenia. But these are the ones we're interested in. We're interested in this area here, this whole region here, and we're interested in Egypt. So Seleucus of Syria took over this portion, and very early, he lost all this. Very early, this was given away. So he concentrated, the Seleucid Empire was around this area, and he moved his capital from Babylon to Antioch. Now, down here we have the Ptolemies of Egypt, and the Ptolemies were given control over Judea. Okay, so that's setting the stage for what is now going to happen. This was the fourfold division of the Grecian Empire, seen in the vision of the prophet Daniel. Okay, so the Medo-Persian bear had been defeated and superseded by the 4-headed leopard of Greece. And that's what we read about in Daniel chapter 7. So this guy, the bear, is gone, and here we have the Grecian Empire with its 4 wings rising up in power. And we have exactly the same vision in chapter 2 of Daniel with Nebuchadnezzar's dream. And what we have with Nebuchadnezzar, same idea, but we have in his idea, the silver kingdom, the silver kingdom was the kingdom of the Medes and Persians, chest of and arms of silver, and that was now superseded by the kingdom of ancient Greece, the kingdom of bronze, represented by the belly and the thighs. Okay, so this had all been prophesied, and it was these dramatic events were now taking place. Okay, now going back to our two kings that we're interested in, that is the Seleucid kings in the north governing Syria, and the Ptolemaic kings in the south governing Egypt and Judea. Now, but as you probably realize, as is always the case, each of these kings had their own agenda, and each of them were ambitious, and none of them was completely happy with the territory that had been allotted to them. So conflicts began almost immediately because both the Seleucids in the north and the Ptolemies in the south are coveting the land of Judea and her very precious trade routes. And that's what the 11th chapter of Daniel is all about. It gives a summary of the battles which took place between these rival kings for over a century and a half. And during this time, Judea, the Jews did remain under Ptolemaic rule. The region was very carefully administered and it was very heavily taxed. And Ptolemy initiated a system where tax collection was farmed out to local officials who used the position, guess what, for their political and economic gain. Again, setting a stage for a lot of what we see in the Gospels. But for nearly a century, Judea was an almost continual battleground between the kings of the north, the Syrians, and the kings of the south, the Egyptians, which so that she might be called the debatable land. She's a hapless pawn in this struggle between the generals, and she was spoiled by her warring foes. So we have wars in 274, 253, 246, and in each of those cases, victory goes to the Ptolemies. But 221, we entered the Fourth Syrian War. And this is a seesaw struggle between Ptolemy IV and the young king Antiochus III of Syria. And that's described in Daniel 11, verses 10 to 12. There it is. The king of the north will muster another army larger than the first. And after several years, he will advance with a huge army fully equipped. So when this war ended in 217 BC, Syria looked like the loser, but Egypt was weakened significantly by the struggle. Antiochus seized the opportunity and invaded Judea in 201, delivered a crippling blow to the Ptolemaic army at Panium, that's Banyas, Caesarea Philippi, and he finally added Judea to his kingdom. Of course, through all these conflicts, the people of Judea are clinging desperately to the apparently forlorn hope of the coming deliverer. Okay, Syrian rule now swings in. Now, the Seleucid monarchs had a very different philosophy of government than the Ptolemies. First of all, they'd grown very accustomed to their regal robes and the pageantry that had come with their experience in the East. And they embraced the idea that they themselves were gods incarnate. They took a deep interest in native affairs and culture, and they shared Alexander's vision, here I am on the second point, of a fusion of East and West. They encouraged the spread of Hellenistic ideas among the people of the East. And through their realm, they established cities modeled after the Greek city-state, the polis. And for example, the Decapolis, again, which we read about in the New Testament, that's a group of Hellenized cities situated east of the Jordan River near Judea and Galilee. Now, the residents of those cities looked to the Greek monarchs as their founders. They were bound together by their identity as islands of Hellenistic culture amid a sea of Easterners. Now, another thing that was very important of this culture, the Seleucids wanted to bequeath to the East, and that was religion. Now, each polis had its patron god, a Greek deity, sometimes the deified king. Temples and statues were erected through the city in the god's honor. The schools, theaters, and public buildings all were designed to encourage the adoration of Greek culture and religion. But the main institution for the dissemination of Hellenism was the gymnasium. Now, in the gymnasia, naked male contestants competed in games honoring Greek gods. And as you can imagine, the traditionally very modest people of the East must have been incredibly scandalized by this at the beginning. You can get used to anything. And also there were many financial benefits and funds available to citizens who enrolled in the polis, and many city leaders eagerly sought those advantages. So we can say the Seleucid Empire was fully engaged in what we can call cultural imperialism. But in the east was now looming the towering shadow of Rome. And the Seleucid kingdom, which once stretched from the Aegean to the borders of India, was now surrounded by foes and rivals and ever threatened with dissolution. Moreover, the Seleucids were soon burdened with the responsibility of paying tribute to Rome and forced to raise taxes throughout the empire. Badly in need of money, where did they look? On the temple in Jerusalem with growing avarice. And that leads us to Antiochus Epiphanes in 174 BC. That's when he ascended to the throne. Now, he was truly one of the really flamboyant characters of history. It's a little bit like Nero. He enjoyed the theater, he fancied himself as an actor and musician. And in the sources that we have, Josephus and the Maccabees, we read how he liked to go through the city and take part in carousing, and sometimes he'd go out and throw jewels to the people, other times he'd throw stones or dates or whatever. Anyway, he was very convinced of his deity, and he took the name Epiphanes, meaning God manifest, or the illustrious God. And his coins were minted with his own face on the surface that usually would have borne the face of Zeus. So at first he was popular with the people of Antioch, but after a while, his very sudden mood swings, there's some theory that he was bipolar, that he had some kind of disorder, but this eventually very much alienated the populace. And we have this quote about him that, like a panther, he could switch from languid relaxation to fierce and violent action in the beat of a heart. Okay, so there's a little bit more about Antiochus, and not quite so flattering. He is called by an opposite designation in Daniel 11:21. He's a contemptible person. His own courtiers evidently concurred, because they called him not Epiphanes, but Epimanes, meaning madman. But he was not so out of touch with reality. He didn't feel the weight of the tribute he owed to Rome. So this is the persecuting king of the north, whose history had been forecast in Daniel chapter 11, verse 21 to 35, and he has been well named the Antichrist of the Old Testament. At first he came in peaceably and by flatteries sought to gain the confidence of the Jews, but afterward became their bitterest persecutor and the profaner of the temple. Okay, meanwhile, in Judea, what's happening there that's also setting the stage for what's going to take place? For a number of years, a dispute had been simmering in Jerusalem between Jews who wished to adopt Greek customs and wanted to wipe away distinctions between Jew and Gentile. They are the Hellenizers, who advocated Greek philosophy, games, and even religion. And they were the predecessors of the Sadducees. Then there were those who clung tenaciously to the holy writing and sacred temple services, and they eventually became known as the Pharisees, from a word meaning to separate. And these became the two parties that were striving for domination in Judea. Right. Now, in 174, that same year, that same important year, a new high priest named Jason arose. He was Joshua, but he decided to take the name of a Greek hero, so he became Jason. And he obtained his post by bribery. And he went on to establish a gymnasium and Hellenistic school in Jerusalem as a prelude to transforming Jerusalem into a Greek polis. Athletic contests were begun, and we read with horror in Maccabees, even the priests neglected their sacrificial duties to participate in wrestling matches, which of course would have been in the nude. Hellenism was becoming fashionable. But I've got a little note down here, an heroic era was about to commence. 168 BC. Now, Antiochus was away campaigning in Egypt once again, and he heard a rumor. A rumor reached Judea that he had died, and the people erupted in joy. Now, when Antiochus heard about this, he was infuriated. And here I have a quote for you. This was the beginning of what happened. This is a quote taken from 2 Maccabees. Raging like a wild animal, he set out from Egypt and took Jerusalem by storm. He ordered his soldiers to cut down without mercy those whom they met and to slay those who took refuge in their houses. There was a massacre of young and old, a killing of women and children, a slaughter of virgins and infants. In the space of 3 days, 80,000 were lost, 40,000 meeting a violent death, and the same number being sold into slavery. (167 BC). Now, in order to consolidate his empire and to strengthen his hold over the region, Antiochus, who's now back in Syria, then decided to outlaw the Jewish religion, and he sent an army to enforce his decree. The Greeks came, a great army. They massacred the residents of Jerusalem, burned private homes, public structures, demolished the walls of Nehemiah, forced their way into the Holy of Holies, carried off the golden candlestick, the table, the incense altar, and other vessels. And here, this is the greatest moment of horror that is predicted in Daniel 11:31. The holy altar of burnt offering was replaced with a pagan altar dedicated to the Greek god Zeus. Upon this, a sow was sacrificed, and a broth made of its unclean flesh was sprinkled throughout the temple. So, of course, this is the abomination of desolation of which the prophet Daniel speaks. Antiochus thus becomes the archetype of the end-time supervillain. So the horror with which a godly Jew regarded this terrible desecration is beyond our conception. Never till the personal Antichrist sits in the temple of God, yet to be erected in Jerusalem in the days of the coming tribulation, will such dreadful scenes be repeated. That is this passage in Daniel that is the one to which Jesus directed the attention of his disciples in Matthew 24 as a sign of the end of the age. And I think that we have here a clue as to what took place here in this situation with this Antiochus as an Antichrist figure, I think it's a forerunner of what's going to take place in the end of time. And that's why it's really been focused on subsequently since that time. Okay, so it's a time of great tribulation in Judea. What happened? There were new laws enacted. On pain of death, all Jews were ordered to abandon their religion and worship Zeus Uranus, the god of heaven. Laws were enacted to forbid them from observing the Sabbath or traditional festivals, circumcising their sons, fierce tortures implemented to persuade the Jews to abandon their faith. Scrolls of the law were burned, and anyone possessing a copy was killed. Those who circumcised their sons were led publicly through the city with babes at their breasts and flung from city walls. Or else they killed the children and hung them around the necks of the mothers, paraded them through the streets. Any who were discovered observing the Sabbath were burned alive. And many Jews believed the persecution was a punishment for their sins, their double-mindedness, and their infatuation with Hellenism. So, for it was a dark time, and for a time the Jews were utterly disheartened. Hope almost died within the breasts of the faithful, when, like the shining forth of the star of the morning, arose Mattathias, who dwelt in Modi'in. This man was the father of 5 sons, the Maccabees of everlasting renown. For them, it was a call to arms, not merely to defend themselves, but more than that, to take the battle to the Greeks and drive them from the land. It was a call to liberation from all foreign domination. So let's go to that story. So in the town of Modi'in, 20 miles northwest of Jerusalem, lived a priest named Mattathias and his 5 sons with a family name Hashmonai. Soon the envoys of Antiochus arrived to their town. An altar was built in the square. The residents were all assembled to hear the royal decree: renounce your old religion, sacrifice to the God of heaven, obey the command of your king. The officers observed Mattathias' distinguished bearing and decided this man should be the first to obey the king's decree, promising he would be counted among the friends of the king. Mattathias: even if all the nations of the world abandon their gods and worship the king's idol, I and my sons will remain true to the Lord. So he makes that pronouncement. But then someone in the crowd, one of the Jews, decides to run forward and to sacrifice on that altar. Mattathias is so enraged that he kills that renegade Jew. And then, he didn't stop there. He then also killed the Greek officials. And then he issued a challenge. All of you who are zealous for the law of the Lord and who are true to his covenant, come and stand with me. So Mattathias, his sons, and many other faithful Jews left their possessions and fled to encamp in the rugged hill country of Judea. The flame of insurrection spread far and wide, and so many rallied to the standard. The Hasmonean revolt had begun, the great Jewish War of Independence, and so they are all rallying to this dominating, heroic figure of Mattathias. But what happened? Early in the revolt, Mattathias died, but not before he gathered his sons about him, and he charged them not to turn aside from warfare till the land and temple were cleansed of the pollution of the heathen. And these are some of his final words to his sons, and they're so stirring that I thought we should read them. So this is from 1 Maccabees. This is what he says to them. Remember the deeds that our ancestors did in their times, and you shall win great honor and an everlasting name. Was not Abraham found faithful in trial, and it was credited to him as righteousness? Joseph, when in distress, kept the commandment, and became Lord of Egypt. Joshua, for executing his commission, became a judge in Israel. David, for his loyalty, received as a heritage a throne of eternal kingship. Elijah, for his burning zeal for the law, was taken up to heaven. Hannukah, Azariah, and Mishael, for their faith, was saved from the fire. Daniel, for his innocence, was delivered from the mouths of the lions. And so consider, from generation to generation, that none who hope in heaven shall fail in strength. So, command of the revolt fell into the hands of his eldest son, Judah, who was given the nickname Maccabeus, probably from the Hebrew word for hammer, because he was like a hammer smashing the rocks. It was referring to his great military exploits. So he traversed the land of Judah, recruited an army of about 6,000, and as his fame began to spread, more Jews began to join the rebels. They began their counter-assault with raids under cover of darkness, targeting towns populated with Gentiles, seizing control of strategic locations, and victory everywhere crowned the efforts of Judah. He surprised the enemy time after time, bursting in on their encampments in the middle of the night, spreading terror and confusion among them. Apollonius, governor of Samaria, went out against him with a great host, but was ignominiously defeated, and at last himself slain, while his army was scattered. And with the sword of Apollonius, the great Maccabean chieftain fought ever afterwards. Okay, another greater army commanded by Seron was sent by Antiochus to annihilate the Jewish company. The two forces met at Beit Horon. Okay, so I've given you a map here, and you can see that all the fighting that I mentioned is all, here's Modi'in, there's Jerusalem, there's Beit Horon, Gilgal, all the fighting. See, the Jews are still in this tiny, tiny area. Okay, so the two forces met at Beit Horon. Seron was haughty and defiant at the head of a vast host. Judah was leading a small company who had been fasting and were weak and discouraged. Yet the Jews threw themselves in the recklessness of their faith upon their disdainful foes and scattered them like chaff before the wind. So Antiochus raged like a maniac as a report of success after success on the part of Judas and his bands reached the Syrian capital. Half of his army was sent to Judea, headed by Lysias, one of his mightiest generals, who was charged to completely extirpate all Israel with 40,000 foot and 7,000 horsemen. And against this mighty army, Judah could oppose only a force of 6,000, but the great arch enemy of God and men was again to find he was powerless against the eternal. So as I've said in the heading here, Satan's great effort to destroy the seed of Abraham and nullify the messianic promise came to naught. Right, another battle. So one last couple of battles. The Syrians pitched at Emmaus, and at Mizpah was the camp of the Jews. With ashes on their heads and sackcloth on their bodies, they fell down before the mighty one of Israel and pleaded for his help. Before daylight, the little army of Israel marched down on the Syrians. A blast of trumpets sounded the assault. The Jews flung themselves on that great army, and within a few moments scattered them. 3,000 Syrians fell. Well, that was pretty well it. Lysias gathered a force of 65,000 in the following year, but again was driven out in disgrace. And so overwhelming was this blow, the Syrian army took years to recover. And in the meantime, 164 BC, the vile Antiochus died a horrible death, raving in madness, with his flesh rotting on his bones. The just recompense, I guess. Okay, but now, as you can see, this has all taken place around Jerusalem. Judah has not yet gone to Jerusalem, but he seized the moment. He invades Jerusalem itself. Jerusalem was in ruins, the temple disfigured, the courts overgrown, sacred altar profane, beautiful gate burned, but they rose to the work. They made new sacred vessels. I'm quoting again from 2 Maccabees. They made new sacred vessels, brought the lampstand, the altar of incense, and the table into the temple. Then they burned incense on the altar and lighted the lamps on the lampstand, and these illuminated the temple. Thus they finished all the work they had undertaken. They rose early on the morning of the 25th day of the 9th month, that is the month of Kislev, and offered sacrifice according to the law on the new altar for burnt offerings that they had made. On the anniversary of the day on which the Gentiles had desecrated it, on that very day, it was rededicated with songs, harps, lyres, and cymbals. All the people prostrated themselves and adored and praised heaven, who had given them success. So for 8 days, they celebrated the dedication of the altar and joyfully offered burnt offerings and sacrifices of deliverance and praise. Tradition says that Judas and his men found only enough oil for 1 day, but it miraculously burned for the entire 8 days of rededication. And an edict was passed that the days of dedication, Hannukah, would be celebrated as a perpetual ordinance among the Jews. And so the Festival of Lights was inaugurated, was born. Now, I'm coming to a close, but I would like, just before finishing our story, I would like to give a quote from Judah, the way he spoke to his men. And we find such inspiring messages all the way through the book of Maccabees. And this is what he said to them. So when they saw the army coming against them, this is his men, they said to Judah, "How can we, few as we are, fight such a strong host as this? Besides, we are weak since we haven't eaten today." They're fasting to prepare for the battle. But Judah said, "Many are easily hemmed in by a few. In the sight of heaven, there is no difference between deliverance by many or by few. For victory in war does not depend upon the size of the army, but on strength that comes from heaven." Okay, so, and this is what he said on another war. He said to the men with him, "Do not fear their numbers or dread their attack. Remember how our ancestors were saved in the Red Sea when Pharaoh pursued them with an army. So now let us cry to heaven in the hope that he will favor us. Remember the covenant with our ancestors and destroy this army before us today. All the Gentiles shall know that there is one who redeems and delivers Israel." Hallelujah. Okay, so Hannukah, what does it mean? It means dedication. And it is, that name is recalling those 2 pivotal affirmations. On the physical level, it refers to the fact that on the 25th of Kislev, the Maccabees confronted a shattered, ransacked sanctuary and immediately rededicated the building to the service of God. But even more significantly, the Maccabees responded to the reality of violent attack by rededicating themselves to their Judaism. They resolved that their Jewish commitment would not be the same as it was before. Rather, it would rise to a higher level and spread the light of faith in even the darkest night. And I think that while I have been studying this incredible story, it has been really speaking to me about what is happening to us in these end times, about the fact that we have an arch enemy, who is so determined to confront and to really trample on and to destroy and to the people of God. And the power that this enemy seems to wield is extremely daunting. It seems something that is impossible to overcome. But what the Maccabees are teaching us is that we need to trust in God, and that our God is able to save by many or by few. And we have the arm of the God of the universe, and we should be declaring our faith and our courage and our belief in his health and in his strength and in his power and in his ability to turn all this situation to his kingdom purposes and his glory. Amen. And I would be very interested, I'm going to hand back to Sharon, and I'll be very interested to hear your comments on that as well. So thank you, everyone.
Oh, thank you, Leslie. Wow, that was an amazing history lesson. I've never studied First Maccabees or Second, but I think I want to read it. And it makes you wonder sometimes why it maybe isn't in the scriptures or somewhere.
Yeah.
I guess it's in the Apocrypha, I imagine.
It is, yeah.
And so it is in the Catholic Bible, and a tremendous story. Did you answer the question, though, that you asked in the beginning? About why this particular battle? Why, when there were so many battles, why did this one? Did you answer that? Did I miss that?
I think I was trying to say that battle is the template for our end time battle.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, because it's a forecast of what's going to take place at the end, with this Antichrist seated in the temple. And I think Jesus himself said, talked about the abomination of desolation. Yeah. And he's referring to Daniel, and Daniel is referring to Antiochus and what takes. So it's a whole prefiguring or foreshadowing of what's going to take place in the end time. And we see the people of Judah are very tiny, and we see the forces confronting them are overwhelming. And I think that's what we see shaping up in our world at the moment.
Yes.
And I think the book of Maccabees certainly spoke to me about really trusting that God wants to do something really mighty, and to trust in him in these times that do look very daunting and very, terrifying, really.
Yes.
But yeah. So anyone else have a comment on that? Would like to
comment or a question, whatever.
Well, I was not familiar with that story, and I really appreciated learning more. Thank you, Leslie.
I'm glad you did. Yeah, so I knew it was a lot of history, but on the other hand, you have to have all that background to really appreciate the story and what takes place, I think.
Yes, yeah. It was all fascinating all the way through, and leading up to you kind of really get the drama of the whole thread of the story, for sure. Yes, wow. I think we're all speechless. You're an end times man. Come on, you must have a comment, don't you? He's not biting. It is a glorious story. I think we just need to process it, but and you can't miss the connection between how Jesus spoke about the end time, what it would be like before his return, and the desecration of the temple. Of course, the Antichrist will want to set himself up to be worshipped in the temple, right? Because that's his own image, his own. So I guess I'm convinced now that they will be building the third temple. And maybe,
I know.
I was never sure. For years, I get that question from people. Do you think they will build the third temple? And I'm beginning to see more and more as we think more about the details of things, because of what, the way the world is going. Yes, they will build the third temple. The Antichrist will help them do it, I think.
And I do get it, this idea of the spiritual temple, and it's a battle, but I don't think that, yes, of course we know that's true, but there's too much that applies to I'm convinced there must be an actual physical event that takes place, not just something inside our hearts.
I think there will be both. I think there, anyway.
Absolutely.
No doubt we are the temple of the Holy Spirit, and that won't change. I hope not. But for all the rest of the pieces to fall into place, it would be the temple. And of course, Ezekiel spends a lot of chapters on that temple, describing it. So yeah, that was great. That was a good. So now next week, talking about at the Feast of Dedication, Jesus speaks when he's celebrating the Feast of Dedication and speaks his great dissertation on the Good Shepherd. So we'll look forward to that next week for sure.
Well, what I would like to do is to follow the Maccabees, because, you know, the second part of the story is not as glorious as the first part of the story. And I think we need
got more Maccabees for us? Is that what you're
I've
saying?
got more Maccabees for you next week.
Okay.
Because it's kind of the decline of the Maccabees, but it's, again, very fascinating history. And I think we need to understand that in order to understand what Jesus said at the Feast of Dedication. We have to interpret it with that context.
Okay.
Just giving you a heads up, a bit of a warning.
Well, the shepherd motif is all through the Old Testament too, isn't it? You know.
Oh yes, of course.
You know, the reference to shepherds, and King David was a shepherd. I mean, there's so many shepherd king combinations. Yeah, fascinating. Right. Well, I think that's it for tonight then. Thank you guys. I hope you were all blessed by that. I'm sure you were as blessed as I am. We got lots to ponder and think about.
That was fascinating.
What's that, Aishia? Yeah.
Aisha, yeah, I said it was really fascinating. Like, and like you, Sharon, I'm wondering, why isn't this in the Bible? This is incredible.
That's right. It truly is.
Well, that's a good question, and I think that probably if we look some more at the Maccabees next week, we'll understand why it's not in the Bible. Yeah,
their glory didn't last that long.
No, the glory didn't last. So unfortunately,
faded out. Yeah, that's true. Okay, well, let's just thank the Lord for what we've been shown tonight, and so, Father, I do thank you so much for this amazing bit of history that we've heard about tonight, and for the bravery and the leadership of this whole Maccabean revolt. And Lord, we do know that our own flesh fizzles out pretty quickly, you know, when the circumstances change. But I thank you for all we can see in this story. And thank you for the miracle of the tradition that talks about the miracle of the light, the oil burning for 8 days when it really shouldn't have. So just a real sign of your presence and your blessing on the cleansing of the temple and how important it was to you and is to you. And there's so many layers of themes tonight. I pray that we would all just ponder these things, and that they would take root in our hearts and minds, that we might be just more and more equipped for the things we see around us, even in our day. Lord, I thank you that you are with us always, that you are the victor even when there's a small group. Lord, in fact, it seems that you love to work with small numbers so that you are glorified, that, you know, when things turn out for good, that your hand, obviously your hand is in it, and only by your power and your love and your victory do we come through. And so we know that we can be assured and be confident, and that you are sovereignly able, and that you go before us and lead us through in these changing times that are challenging for us. But Lord, there's such a sense of your presence, and we just want to worship you and thank you. And yes, we're so thankful. So bless all these folks tonight, Lord. Just bless them in every way that you know that you'd like to bless them, and Lord, that their needs would be met in you, because that's just what you do. I praise you and thank you in Jesus' name.
Amen. Thank you, Ashley. Thank you, Sharon. Thanks, Sharon.
Bye.
Thank you, guys.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.
Oh.
Good night.
Good night.